We want to turn our attention back to the broader West Asian region and some of the fallout that we're seeing in many of the states surrounding Palestine and near environs as the ongoing genocide moves forward. We are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics. Giorgio, as always, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you guys. Let's please try to avoid talking about Ben Shapiro.
I promise that I won't bring it up. I can't control Rania, unfortunately, so maybe she will. But I wanted to start with some of this change. I mean, obviously, we've seen a lot of different dynamics obviously be changed by what's happening in Gaza. It's obviously such a moving issue. I mean, we've seen in Jordan, especially recently now, the ongoing protests that have been happening. And, maybe not even necessarily Jordan specifically, although that's the one that's on my mind. But do you feel that this conflict, this genocide and what we see happening in Palestine is having a lasting effect, maybe it's subterranean, on many of these regional countries where people obviously are very in favor of the Palestinian cause, but their governments are sometimes lagging behind?
Yeah, I think even if the genocide were to stop tomorrow, everything that's happened throughout the past 6 months will probably change the Middle East for many years, if not decades to come. Obviously, what's going on in Palestine is having huge effects throughout the wider Arab region. It's felt most intensely, I think, in the countries that are geographically closest to Israel, Palestine, the ones that feel the heat the most from everything that's taking place in Gaza. But really, for the most part, across the Arab world, I think what we see is something that we've known even before October 7th, but it's just more and more highlighted these days, is that the Palestinian issue really demonstrates a lot of weakness and vulnerabilities of different Arab regimes. What we realize is that these Arab governments definitely have to strike some very, very delicate balancing acts. On one hand, they have societies filled with people who are obviously very emotional about the Palestinian issue, and they have to cater to that. And that is usually in the form of kind of rhetoric and symbolic moves at the UN, putting out certain statements. But at the same time, a lot of these regimes are very dependent on the US for economic and security support. And they also don't want to directly challenge Israel. So they're in a very, very delicate, they're in a very sensitive and vulnerable state right now. And I think this is why we see these Arab governments pushing so hard to try to get the Biden administration to pressure Israel into agreeing to a ceasefire. I don't think it's, excuse me for being cynical, I don't think it's really so much about caring for the Palestinian people, but it's more about these governments wanting to preserve sort of a status quo order inside their own borders and throughout the wider region.
No, so those are really good points, Giorgio. And I want to ask you specifically about Saudi Arabia, because we saw this sort of indefinite postponement of the U.S. delegation that was supposed to go to Saudi Arabia. Jake Sullivan and I think Brett McGurk and was it Amos Hochstein or trying to push this idea that normalization between the Saudis and Israelis is still possible. But the fact that they postponed it indefinitely, I mean, one, does that mean that this is dead in the water? And then just to add to the Saudi question here, the Saudis are saying that they have these preconditions for normalization. They're not shutting down the idea entirely, but they're saying they have preconditions, and that includes Palestinian statehood, which, of course, is not something the Israelis are going to agree to. So I guess the question I'm going to ask with that is this even realistic, or is this just the Saudis buying time in a moment when they know that they can't sell normalization to their own population?
Yeah, it's a good question. At the end of last year, the pro-Israel think tank in DC, WINEP, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, put out they released their findings of a poll that they conducted in Saudi Arabia, and they found out that 96% of the Saudi population believes that all Arab states should cut off all political, diplomatic, and economic relations with Israel. So the Saudi leadership obviously cannot ignore where the public stands. Even before October 7th, normalization would have been incredibly risky from a political standpoint. in Saudi Arabia. But I mean, there's a consensus among pretty much everyone in the kingdom that Israel is waging a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. It's just at this point, the talk of normalization under current circumstances would just be way too toxic for the leadership in Saudi Arabia to consider. I think probably after the dust settles in Gaza, we'll see the Saudis and Israelis cooperating and coordinating in some under the table ways. There's going to be sort of an economic normalization that will probably continue to go forward. But in terms of like establishing full-fledged diplomatic relations, I don't see that happening for a long time. That being said, people in the Biden administration and many people here in DC seem to think that this is, the path that Saudi Arabia is going down. I think they don't really understand the predicament that the Saudi leadership faces right now. They are continuing to push this agenda of bringing Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords.
On the same token, I wonder what you think about the sort of state of the sort of Saudi-Iran rapprochement. I mean, obviously it's sort of tentative engagement, but it does seem like both sides are continuing to try to engage with each other. I mean, I noticed that, at least allegedly, according to a report I saw the other day, that, Saudi Arabia was a back channel from Iran to the United States. So, I mean, it does seem that they're still trying to talk and still trying to, bridge different gaps. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot there for those two countries to come closer, but it has been, interesting, I think, to note in this past couple months that it does seem that both sides are continuing to sort of actively try to engage with one another.
Yeah, just last month marked the 1-year anniversary of Saudi Arabia and Iran signing the renormalization agreement in Beijing. And the fact of the matter is, ever since that moment in which they signed the diplomatic deal in China, they've taken steps to really build on that deal, with embassies reopening, the ambassadors going back. Last year in November, Raisi was the first Iranian president to come to Saudi Arabia since 2012. So it's really clear that both Riyadh and Tehran want to build on the renormalization, and the fact that the Gaza war and its expansion into other parts of the Middle East has not thrown off this detente in Saudi-Iranian relations, I think really speaks to the depth of this effort to improve relations on the part of both Saudi Arabia and Iran. I think both countries still see it very much in their interest to not return to the state of sky-high hostilities that was taking place only a few years ago. That being said, there certainly are some deep suspicions that both countries have of the other. It's not a relationship that's free of tension, but I think both sides realized it was in their interests to engage in more dialogue and diplomacy. And the fact of the matter is the Gaza war has, to some extent, I would argue, highlighted how there even is some alignment between the Saudis and the Iranians. They're both demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. They're both opposed to what Israel is doing in Gaza, and they've been able to sort of come together in different instances to sort of show their support for diplomatic efforts aimed at winding down the conflict.
Giorgio, I also wanted to, I guess we're just going to go country by country here, but I have a couple questions for you about the UAE. First off, we had this visit a couple weeks ago. It was a really big deal. The Hezbollah official Wafii Safa visited the UAE for over negotiations over the prisoner file, which is something that was had been going on earlier. I don't believe this was connected to the current situation in Gaza, but it does speak to some sort of shift with the UAE, which is obviously, very anti-Hezbollah. So I'm curious if you can talk about the significance of that. I know that you recently wrote a piece on that, but furthermore, with regard to the UAE, and here I go just like smashing two questions in one once again, but do you think, to bring it to the issue of Gaza, are current regional tensions, do you believe, at all impacting the UAE's ability to continue to integrate its economy with Israel's following its normalization deal?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important to realize that the UAE has been making some adjustments in its foreign policy in recent years, conducting much more of, I would say, sort of a non-aligned foreign policy, or maybe we can say sort of a multi-aligned strategy to geopolitics. The UAE has improved its relationship with Iran, renormalized with Syria. It also entered into this normalization agreement with Israel, mended fences with Qatar. So the UAE is trying to be more of a neutral state in the region, and also internationally, the UAE is trying to become much more autonomous from the West. And we see the UAE moving a lot closer to Russia and China, as well as India. So it's sort of like a foreign policy of kind of, 360 degrees of partnerships. Israel is definitely important to the UAE, and as the UAE wants to sort of establish itself as more of a kind of geoeconomic hub that links the global north to the global south, links Africa to Asia, Asia to Europe, so on and so forth. The UAE definitely values its relationship with Israel, and I would say probably Emirati-Israeli normalization is irreversible. I do not see the suffering in Gaza leading to a situation whereby Abu Dhabi would abrogate the Abraham Accords. What the UAE has been trying to do, and this is really more about optics than anything else, is to speak out against Israel. And the Emirati officials have been quite vocal and quite confident when it comes to condemning Israel. At the time of the Gaza war breaking out, the UAE was the only Arab country sitting on the UN Security Council. And so the UAE sort of took advantage of that position to sort of stand up internationally to condemn what Israel's doing. But again, that's really about words and rhetoric. Below the surface, I don't really think the UAE-Israel relationship has changed much because of what's going on in Gaza. There's not even really been like any downgrading of relations. There was a news article today in an Israeli media site saying that the UAE was going to cease diplomatic cooperation with Israel. I don't know how much credibility there is, or even what it means to cease diplomatic cooperation as long as the diplomatic relations still exist. So, short answer here, I think the UAE is trying to really move ahead as business as usual when it comes to the normalization process with Israel. And I'll just add as a final point, one of the reasons why the UAE wants to do this is because being the driver behind the Abraham Accords has given the UAE so much maneuverability in Washington. It did a lot to really get the pro-Israel lobby in Washington on the side of the UAE. There are so many things the UAE has done that upset the diplomatic establishment in Washington, whether we're talking about working with the Wagner Group in Africa, talking about the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, reintegration of the Syrian government into the regional fold. All of these things the UAE has done upset policymakers in Washington. But every time there's some criticism of the UAE, people say, well, there's the Abraham Accords, so let's be sure not to criticize the UAE. And I would argue it's probably this factor about the UAE's position and its image in Washington helps us understand why the UAE, I really don't think, will be pulling out of the normalization deal.
I heard, I don't know how true it is, but that UAE is lobbying behind the scenes Congress to lift the Caesar sanctions on Syria. But the relevant thing to me about that is it does seem that the sort of, well, it's not sort of, the attempt by the Gulf states to back the efforts to change governments there in Syria has now totally reversed, and that it seems that pretty much most of the Gulf states and many of the Arab states seem to be back on board with bringing Syria back into the fold. And I don't know how much of that is in relationship to just the changed circumstances on the ground, both in Syria and different places. But I wonder your evaluation of the possibilities of some of America's allies sort of shifting sands here on the U.S. potential stance towards Syria, if it will have any difference at all.
The UAE and the US are definitely not on the same page when it comes to Syria. The UAE definitely thinks the Caesar Act is a very problematic policy. The UAE definitely is really the Arab state that's driving the Arab efforts to bring Syria back into the fold. A number of years before Saudi Arabia renormalized with Damascus was when the UAE, actually back in December 2018, reopened its embassy inside Damascus. That being said, as long as the U.S. is imposing the Caesar Act, it seems that, at least for now, that is having the effect of preventing the Gulf states from making big investments in Syria, because, as everyone knows, the Caesar Act comes with these secondary sanctions. So it's not just U.S. entities that would be punished under this legislation for doing business with Syria, but also third parties all over the world, including in countries such as the UAE. But I think the UAE is looking at Syria with a sort of a very long-term approach, and thinking that at some point even the West is going to sort of come around to renormalizing with the Syrian government. And I think the thinking in Abu Dhabi is that when there are opportunities to make investments in Syria, the UAE will sort of receive priorities and special treatment, because so early on, before many other Arab states were willing to re-embrace Assad, the UAE was, reopening its embassy in Damascus in 2018, and then welcoming Bashar al-Assad himself into the UAE as early as March 2022. And all of that stuff, the Syrian government will definitely be remembering for a long time.
Indeed.
And
now, of course, I was just going to say, now, of course, Syria is in a strange situation where it's normalized with a lot of these countries, but because of those sanctions, it still can't really quite have the economic relationship it wants. And then it gets bombed by Israel. Whether it's like Aleppo, they bomb Aleppo all the time now. It's just normal. Or the Syrian Golan, or, Damascus, where they just bombed the Iranian embassy. I was just adding,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if there's anything you want to say about the significance of. Oh, go ahead.
Well, if you want to speak to the significance of that, but I want to add one element. I do want to add one element that I think is notable. What do you think in the context of a lot of these things we've been talking about, the renormalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, a more balanced view of regional relations? Countries, Oman comes to mind, to some degree Iraq comes to mind, who sort of have been doing a lot of diplomatic work to try to set the table for around these. Do you think there's some level of vindication for some of the states that have been arguing for a more balanced sort of regional relationship, between the Gulf states and Iran, between the various Arab states themselves, in the context of what we see happening now?
That's a great question. And you're absolutely right that there were a number of Arab countries, such as Oman and Qatar, that for a long time said the way to deal with the tensions between Iran and certain countries in the Arab world was through diplomacy and more dialogue, and that it was important to sort of bring Iran into regional security initiatives rather than trying to isolate Iran. And from the perspective of Omani and Qatari policymakers, they very much welcome the renormalization of Saudi-Iranian relations. And I think, as everyone knows, it was really actually Oman and Iraq that did the very heavy lifting to bring about that renormalization deal. While China gets a lot of the credit, the fact of the matter is the Omanis and the Iraqis did really the hard work. And then when it was basically about 95% done, they needed the deal to sort of be signed in a global capital, the capital of a global power, so it would have some more legitimacy, and that you could have a large power like China kind of be the guarantor. So they moved over to Beijing basically to sign the agreement. But again, it was really Muscat and Baghdad that did a lot of the hard work to bring the Saudis and Iranians to that point. And I think in general, there's a view among pretty much all the countries in the Gulf, for the most part, that Iran is a permanent neighbor, and that while U.S. foreign policy will change and many international circumstances will change, the fact that Iran exists in this part of the world is a permanent factor, and that it's ultimately in their interests to find a way to sort of share the neighborhood with Iran and not count on a country like the United States to always be protecting them from Iran, but instead to find a way to live with the Iranians. And in my opinion, this is extremely healthy and necessary.
Well, it has been very fantastic to have you, as always, here. Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.